It's obvious. Most American cities are segregated by design. If you've ever been to major metropolitan regions, you can see a particular racial pattern. In Austin, it is west-east. In Chicago, there is a north-south divide. In areas like Washington, D.C., the Anacostia River is used to create a barrier. This is not a coincidence. The government deliberately created segregated housing. This type of segregation spans decades. Here is how the history of housing affects Black communities.
In the 20th century, white land developers made extensive use of something called racially restrictive covenants as formidable and legal weapons of housing discrimination.
As the Black population increased, they faced housing practices that were completely racist and yet completely legal. One of the worst was a practice called redlining, which allowed banks to refuse home loans to Black residents wanting to move into mostly white neighborhoods.
They wrote clauses into deeds that were meant to prevent all future owners from selling or leasing to certain racial and ethnic groups.
In the first half of the 20th century, Black Americans moved from mostly rural areas in the South to urban areas in the North. In 1900, around 90% of Black families lived in the South. By the 1970s, roughly 70% lived in cities, mainly in the North. To reduce the costs, factory owners started actively employing Black male workers. They knew they could pay them lower wages than white men, which resulted in a massive economic gap between whites and Blacks. Centuries of exploitation, segregation, and discrimination have left Black Americans much poorer than white Americans. The median white household has a net worth of 10 times that of a median Black household. Because of racial segregation, a major portion of the Black population is condemned to experience a social environment where joblessness, poverty, and crime are rampant. Life, where many children are born out of wedlock, people are on welfare, or fail to finish their education. This constant exposure to this type of environment drastically reduces Black chances for economic and social success. This type of segregation started way back, from the 1930s to the 1960s. The government added policies that created residential segregation of African American families. These policies have a major role to play in the substantial Black-white income gap. By the end of the 60s, legal segregation was abolished, but residential segregation remained and continues to exist in every American metropolitan area. How did residential segregation create such a massive wealth gap between whites and Blacks? What had the biggest impact was the policy of the Veterans Administration, VA, and the Federal Housing Administration, FHA. The goal was to move the white working class from urban areas into single-family homes in the suburbs. These destinations included the east side of New York City, Panorama City, close to Los Angeles, Daly City, and Westlake near San Francisco, and many more. Developers couldn't have collected this much capital on their own. After all, these were massive developments, and public financing was necessary. The VA and the FHA banned resale, sale, and rental to Black families. In the 20th century, a returning white war veteran could purchase a home for roughly $9,000 with a mortgage cheaper than rent in public housing and without a down payment. As the years went by, white families were building equity. They could send their children to college, put some money aside for emergencies, retirement, or collect wealth they would later pass on to their children or grandchildren. Let's take a closer look at the impact of these policies during each decade. 1930s. Did you know that hoods and ghettos were built on purpose? In 1933, there was a housing shortage. From 40% to 50% of all home mortgages in the US were in default. Borrowers failed to make monthly payments on home loans, and the entire home financing system was about to collapse. This was a Depression-era crisis. The federal government started a program specifically designed to segregate and increase housing stock. This program was set in motion under the New Deal, which was known as a state-sponsored system of segregation. The goal was simple: ensure housing to white lower middle class and middle class families. Black Americans and other people of color were to be pushed into urban housing projects. This became the perfect time to create a housing discrimination and hoods known as redlining. This ranking system was meant to represent neighborhoods in the southern and northern states. The system included 4 ranks from highest to lowest: A, green; B, blue; C, yellow; D, red. Neighborhoods where foreigners and Jews lived had a B or C rating. Those with Black households, regardless of their status, had a D rank. This is where the term redlining came from. So, how did the government make this possible? Residents of red neighborhoods were denied mortgages or home insurance. This prevented black families from having private housing. In the meantime, the Federal Housing Administration subsidized builders who mass-produced whole subdivisions for whites to never sell their homes to black Americans. This meant that whites had better employment and industry opportunities, which drove up unemployment rates for the black community. Whites living in the suburbs could accumulate wealth over the years by earning equity in their homes. They had cheap mortgages, could save more, and acquired better financial stability than black families. Millions of white families benefited from private loans insured by the FHA. Low-income white households could finally join the middle class and build a stronger community, while the color-coded maps kept black families at the bottom of the food chain. 1940s. Redlined communities and racially restrictive covenants were still rampant. The FHA even imposed heavier restrictions after working on more housing projects. New homes could only be resold and sold to white families, and private lenders across the nation continue to do so. Here's an example from the 40s. The FHA denied insurance to a private builder in Detroit since he planned to take on a housing development close to a black neighborhood. The FHA didn't want to insure the development. They only insured homes in white neighborhoods. The private builder constructed a concrete wall 6 feet high and half a mile long. This wall was meant to keep the two neighborhoods segregated. The FHA then gladly accepted to insure the houses. 1950s. In the 1950s, housing segregation continued. Like in Louisville, for example, a white homeowner bought and resold a home to a black American family in the 1950s in the community of Chivoli. This was a white neighborhood. The police protected mobs that firebombed the home. The white homeowner who sold the home was then tried and found guilty of sedition. This police protection was, in fact, in violation of the 14th Amendment, but it didn't matter. At the time, there were countless cases of police-protected mobs who drove black families out of their homes that they rented or bought in white neighborhoods. Every single one of them was in violation of the 14th Amendment. 1960s. In the early 60s, mobs weren't the only problem. The more African American families moved to the cities, they were met with severe racial violence at work and in neighborhoods. One popular white supremacist view stated that with a simple touch of an African American body, people could contract diseases. This led to a number of whites violently defending their properties and neighborhoods. Soon, neighborhood barriers turned into racial barriers. These were at the core of the unrest and riots in the 1960s. In 1968, the Fair Housing Act was here to make a change. It banned racially restrictive covenants, but the discrimination continued. Communities now had new zoning rules divided by income and wealth. This led to a lot of homes driving up their prices. The thing is, these decades-old policies already took their toll on American society, especially for black American families. Black American households had a fraction of the wealth of white households. A large part of this wealth came from these housing investments. Black families who couldn't own private homes a couple of years back were denied the chance to build equity. So it was normal that many black families couldn't afford to live in communities with better employment opportunities and schools. 1970s. The decade of the 1970s is often remembered as the one with the most positive improvements in decreasing social segregation in the educational and work environment. Many studies agree that residential segregation reduced slightly between the 60s and the 70s, but racial segregation levels remained the same in areas with high minorities. African American families were still being targeted by refinancing programs and predatory mortgages. In the 20th century, black families took a leap of faith. They left the South to escape racism and live a better life, but were met with racism in the North and were forced to live in terrible housing conditions without the chance to build equity. The fact is, this country has a legacy of racial segregation and discrimination at a structural level. This racial hierarchy still remains. That's because the decades of housing segregation have had a major economic impact on black families for generations. It's important that we understand the extent of this segregation before we are able to fix it. The Fair Housing Act was created in an effort to help the black community and people of color. Today, the gap between white and black homeownership rates is wider now than it was in 1960, when housing discrimination was rampant and legal. U.S. Census Bureau data shows, in 2022, 74.6% of white households owned their homes, compared with 45.3% of black households, a gap of more than 29 points. In 1960, the white home ownership rate was 65%, and the black rate was 38%, a 27-point gap. But this isn't entirely our fault. This is due to inflation, rising home prices, and the redlining that still occurs today. This is only scratching the surface of our true history. If you want to learn more, click the video on the screen. It's a crazy story that will change your perspective on life.